So I want to touch on the last thing. This last tweet kind of blew up for a couple different reasons. It was from Leela Rose. It said, breaking: infant bodies may indicate infanticide after attempted abortions. The bodies of at least 5 preborn children, some of whom may have been born alive and then killed, have been discovered in Washington, D.C. Now, after this thread, if you guys choose to go look at this thread, I just want to give you a graphic warning. There are very graphic pictures of these babies that you'll see. So just if you are not ready for that, don't go look at those. I'm still furious from seeing those images.
And don't feel bad. I myself, Michael gave me the warning, and I'm like, I'm going to take you for your word, and because I like to think of it in a very masculine way. I'm extremely sensitive to that type of material, specifically just blatant infanticide.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind if you want to get it. But when she shared these, it blew up. It went all over. I think even at the time that I took this screenshot today, there's nearly 10,000 retweets between the tweets and the quote tweet. There's a lot. And it got shared a ton. And a lot of those were in regards to I think a lot of people are probably a lot past the days maybe of people standing on the corner square in a town holding up pictures of fetuses and protesting that way, but that was basically akin to what this was. And I think a lot of people were just woken up maybe to the reality of what this is, what abortion, how horrible it is. And people were sharing this. I think a lot of the ones I saw were to remind people like, hey, this is what we as believers are fighting against when we say, we don't believe in abortion. We think this is wrong. And it was interesting in regards to, like, I didn't see a lot of people that were declaring themselves to be Christian saying that abortion was okay. I'm sure those were in the comments. But it's one of those things where I think whenever we see these sort of images, it does sort of elicit a response in us that even if you don't see the images, again, a lot of people were tweeting, hey, you really should have put a warning on this because, it triggered a lot of people in regards to a lot of mothers that had lost babies, things like that. But on the abortion thing specifically, I think there was a lot of people that are like, oh, wow, okay, this is what we're talking about. This isn't, I think sometimes when people think of abortion, they think of, some, non-developed sort of sack of something. And as Christians, and I do want to get to what we were talking about before we went live, as far as sort of the history of it and what you were talking about as far as, Molech and all of that, because I think that's a really important background to it. But as believers, I think our response to this issue, right? And I know people are going to me and Matt haven't talked about this. I don't know where he stands on this. I know I got a podcast, or actually it already came out, where me and Rob talked about it on the Bible Imposter podcast, where as believers, my stance is like, I'm not okay with almost all abortions being ended. Like, for me, it is murder, and any child. It's one of those things. And I get that there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of people that have nuance there. There's a lot of people that have a lot of discussions there. But I think these images really kind of sum it up of what this looks like, as far as, hey, this is what's really happening. So with the little bit of time we have left, do you want to kind of get into what you were sort of talking when we were texting back and forth about sort of where this isn't just a new concept of evil. Like, this has been held as evil for a while.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When you look to specifically the time that the Hebrews were settling into Canaan, and they were coming into contact with these ancient tribal Canaanite groups, arguably the most detestable form was the ancient ritual of infant sacrifice, and most people know that most prominently in the worshipers of Molech and Baal. So you have in the Old Testament several references to the valley of Hinnom, and in Hebrew, Gin Hinnom. And in this particular valley, which is actually just outside of where Jerusalem would eventually come to be founded, in this valley is where either the majority or the central site of where those worshiping Molech and Baal in the act of child sacrifice, they would come to this to this valley in order to cause their children to pass through the fire of offering these burnt sacrifices of either fetuses that had that like the babies that women had lost, even abortions in the ancient world, infanticide, if a baby came out and it had a deformity, if it was stillborn, sometimes if somebody just had too many children or whatever the case may be, and they would bring these babies here and they would offer them as fire sacrifices to these gods. And you can see in the Old Testament that it is arguably the most detestable form of idolatry that the Jews in the Scripture addresses. Now, what is extremely gut-wrenching about this and eye-opening, or at least it was for me, is to see the progression and the role that the Valley of Hinnom plays specifically in the development or the revelation on the concept of hell. Because in Hebrew, like I said, the Valley of Hinnom in Hebrew is Gan Hinnom. And when Greek began to become the prominently written form of language and secondary spoken to Aramaic, but in Greek and also in our Greek New Testaments, when Jesus or the other writers speaks of Gehenna, Gehenna is the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Valley of Hinnom. And when we read it in English, most of the time when you see the word hell, like for instance when Jesus says it is better, if your hand calls you to sin, it is better to cut it off, or it is better to enter life maimed than it is to be cast, your entire body to be cast into Gehenna, which was Greek literally for the valley of Hinnom. And so when Jesus is saying this, he's saying like it's better to do this than for you to be thrown into the valley of Hinnom, where all of this child sacrifice went on, where people would go and burn their refuse, so on and so forth. And so when you take this idea of the Valley of Hinnom, of Gehenna, as a representation of God's wrath and judgment upon sin, and you look at the history of this location and you see that it is so cursed, that it is so detestable because of abortion, essentially, that infanticide, the murdering and the offering and the removal of life, the murder of these children and these babies is the foundation from which the concept of hell then grew. And so take from that whatever implications that you want, but in God, in the eyes of the God of life, this act, this situation is heinous enough to be what the concept of punishment for sin is then built upon.
Yeah. Well, I think that speaks a lot to it in regards to, and I know we'll have to schedule one of these lives too, where we kind of talk. I'm sure we will be able to find a tweet or somebody saying something about hell, but I think that we could have a huge conversation just about the development of that and the history of that within Judaism and Christianity. But I think what you said there is a good sort of place to end this conversation on, in regards to whenever we as believers, as followers of Jesus, are talking about just the absolute depravity of this act and what it means. That's something we need to have. I mean, we need to have that in mind, because I think that opens up a whole nother lens to the conversation. This isn't just about this lady and this man, or this situation that's occurring, like, obviously as believers, like, let me just say this, obviously as believers, we should be the first people there to take care of, to support, to be the hands and feet of Jesus to people. But that cannot be used as an excuse to be like super nice and be like, oh yeah, you just do whatever you want. Because as believers, I mean, we're, as you said, Matt, this God of life, right? There is this innate value and worth in us as individuals. And I've heard every silly, I will call it dumb argument in the world that you can try to bypass, that, that's not a real person and that's not a human being, but it is. And as believers, we should be doing, I think, everything we can to speak up for those that can't speak for themselves, to be the hands and feet in Jesus in these situations, to say, hey, if we can do anything for that. Now, on that note, I will end on this. I know this is different around probably the entire country. But I know there's some people that we know personally, me and my wife, that are currently fostering a child. And they told us today, they're like, they can't find enough people to foster kids. They're having, in my particular state, they're having to send kids out of state because they can't find enough people to foster. And I think that's one of the things that that's been banging around in my head all day to, just to be like, wow, okay, what does that mean for me? But I think for all of us as believers, that's something we need to consider. There is a part for us to play in this. And there is a right and righteous indignation for this act that is occurring. But in that same righteous indignation that we have to say, what is this going to propel us to do then? What, other than just being mad, what are we going to do about this? And I think there's a lot of implications that we clearly don't have time to get into today, as far as legislation, as far as how we can vote and how we can act, but also just the everyday things that we can do for maybe the children that are here, and getting involved maybe in that. Maybe we'll have a whole nother discussion on that another day. But I think that if, as a believer, there should be this righteous anger in you that this act even occurs, but that should also drive us to do something as well. So do you have anything to say before maybe we end this?
No, I mean, I think I'm good. I think it's just about time we can
Cool.
wrap it up.